This is very impressive. American Douglas medals. I want to get a chance to look at all the things you do here, but congratulations on maintaining a strong business in a tough environment. And Scott and Jeff, this is your business, right? The owners. Would you guys stand up here so people, these are the guys that run this place. Now, last night, as I was watching the State of the Union address, I took some notes. All right, and so you see, I crossed some things out, and I thought I'd just speak from those notes this morning and give you my reaction to what I heard. By the way, I thought Mitch Daniels' address was a heck of a lot better than the president's. But my first take was this, which is that as I watched the president speak, I was reminded of his trip to Florida just a week or so ago when he spoke in Fantasyland. Because he was speaking in Fantasyland again last night. He seems so extraordinarily detached from reality, detached from what's going on in Florida. I mean, he came to Fantasyland, but apparently didn't spend much time in the communities around Fantasyland and around this state. He said last night how well things are going. If you really think that things are going well in this country, that we're on the right track, and that his policies are working, you ought to vote for him. But I think on that basis, if we ask the American people if they think things are going well or not so well, and he wants to get the votes of those who think it's going well, he's not going to be president very long. And I believe, as I've gone around this state and around other states across the nation, that people are hurting. The income for middle Americans has been devastated under these last several years. As a matter of fact, over the last 4 years, the median income in America has dropped by 10%. And that's at the same time that healthcare costs are up, gasoline costs are up, food prices are up. And so people are really feeling the squeeze in the middle class. Here in Florida, 9.9% unemployment. And the real unemployment and underemployment level is 18%, almost 1 out of 5 people. And of course, you know the foreclosure story. 1/4 of all the foreclosed homes in America, right here in Florida. So, Mr. President, things aren't going so swimmingly. In fact, things are pretty tough for Americans across this country. And in my view, when you got up and said on the Today Show 3 years ago that if you couldn't turn around this economy in 3 years, you'd be looking at a one-term proposition, well, you're right, and we're here to collect. Now, there's another way in which I thought he was detached from reality last night and detached from the people of America. He laid out a number of prescriptions. Some of them were just, I thought, flat wrong. But some were actually not bad. He said some of the things that you looked at and said, well, that makes some sense. So, for instance, he said we really ought to lower the corporate tax rates to be competitive with others in the world, that ours are the highest in the world. Except he's done the opposite. He's detached from his own reality, what he has done. His words and his actions are so different, it's sometimes hard to believe. So he has raised taxes on companies as opposed to lowering them. And then there was that whole riff about regulation and how regulations burden enterprises and small business. Didn't he realize that under his presidency, the rate of new regulation introduction has tripled? And he's also laid out a whole series of new regulations that he wants to put in place. So he says he wants to cut regulations even though he's the guy that dramatically increased them. And then there was the talk about energy. Could you believe that? Saying he was in favor of any of the above, he said. Any of the above energy resources. He wants to use all these energy resources. It's like, wait a second. Isn't this the guy that's been holding off offshore drilling? Isn't this the guy whose EPA has made it almost impossible for us to get oil out of North and South Dakota and parts of Oklahoma and Texas? Isn't this the guy whose regulators are making it almost impossible to get natural gas out of Pennsylvania? I was with one senior executive, chief executive of a big of a big chemical company. He said, we just announced a $20 billion factory in Saudi Arabia. We would have loved to have had it here in the U.S., but we can't count on getting out the natural gas because of government regulators. This is a president who talks about deregulation even as he regulates, who talks about lowering taxes even as he raises them, who talks about developing all of our energy resources even as he tries to shut them down. Coal in particular. regulation after regulation, making it almost impossible for coal users and for coal miners to be successful. And then, of course, there was his discussion of China. I must admit that I took some pleasure in the fact that he's talking about cracking down on China, even as he has not done so. He's had the occasion to label China as a currency manipulator, which would allow him to apply tariffs to Chinese products where they have manipulated currency to kill American jobs, or where they've hacked into our computers to steal our technology, or where they've stolen our intellectual property, our patents, our designs, our know-how. And so even as he's talking about cracking down on China, he's left the door wide open to them to come in and run across our countryside, stealing our jobs and killing our businesses. The detachment between reality and what he says is so extraordinary. I was just shaking my head as I watched the TV last night. I think it's time to have somebody who says what he means and means what he says. And if I'm president, that's the kind of president I'll be. Now, when I got up this morning, Ann was already awake, and she turned to me. We were still in bed, and she said, "You know, the funny thing about listening to Barack Obama is that you not only have to listen to what he says, but you have to think about what he didn't say." My guess is that what he didn't say was probably even more disturbing and detached from reality than some of the things he did say. What he didn't say last night is that we're spending too much and borrowing too much, and that America is on a collision course with debt, and that if we don't get off this course, we could sink the American economy and go into calamity. We're, if you will, a virtual Titanic, and he's saying full speed ahead. The difference, of course, is that with the Titanic, they couldn't see the icebergs. In this case, we can see the iceberg. We see it. We're headed towards it. And he's saying full speed ahead. It is inexplicable that he can speak to the American people about the State of the Union and not describe the massive deficits we have, the fact that he has put in place almost as much public debt by the end of his first 4 years, his only 4 years. He will have put He will have put in place almost as much public debt as all the prior presidents combined. And then Obamacare, we had another $1 trillion deficit that we can't afford, a $1 trillion entitlement rather, we can't afford. He is imperiling the future of America and is unwilling to speak about it. Also unwilling to speak about the need to secure and protect Medicare and Social Security. Perhaps he doesn't want to talk about Medicare very much because he cut Medicare $500 billion to help pay for his Obamacare. I hope we remind our senior citizens in Florida and across the country, there's only one president in history